I'll say a couple of things. So,
Do it.
welcome everybody to week 3 of Illich. You can hide right behind me, Bryan.
It's my mood today.
We were just talking before the recording. Bryan was talking about being burnt from being sick because he's so burnt out because he's been going so hard for the last like 9 months. But this is like the final stretch for him, and that's exciting. For us, I am back, baby, and so I'm really excited for what's coming up here soon at Theory Underground. So I'm just going to say a couple things about that before turning it over. And so basically, tomorrow, no, not tomorrow. This coming Sunday, we're going to have a discussion that will be about critical media theory and critical doxology and Timenergy. Basically, if you've been to any of those lectures, even if you've just seen the free ones that were put up on the YouTube channel, come talk about it. We'll do some breakout rooms, reconvene, talk. These are when Ann and I usually kind of switch more into like interviewer mode, and we're just genuinely curious about your own time and energy and media usages, experiences, and in this case, comfort crisis kinds of experiments. That's going to be the experiment everyone's talking about, going outside of your comfort zone. What it does for us. But it's also setting us up for thinking about the unconscious and the social unconscious and how it relates to discomfort, risk, and nature, as well as violence, which is something we'll be getting into over the next couple of months. And this July is coming up really quickly. Lacan Seminar 11, taught by Todd McGowan, is coming up. That's the final lecture of Illich is going to be on July 4th. And then the lectures are, there's going to be a lecture every Sunday for the month of July. Anne gets to take the month of July off. And Benjamin Studebaker is going to give us an introductory talk on each of the 3 syllabuses that he would teach for political philosophy at Cambridge. So the first one is going to be on the first Sunday of July. The second one will be on the third Sunday of July. And then the third one will be on the first Sunday of August. And then the second and fourth Sunday events in July, these are for the monthly subscribers, are going to be lectures by myself and Michael Downs of The Dangerous Maybe. He's going to be doing a lecture on the superego versus the big other. And I'll be doing a follow-up on Bourdieu because there's a ton of stuff I didn't get to that I want to. Talking about basically superego and the big other and the social unconscious. That'll be a 2-part lecture. And then we'll do a follow-up for that sets us all up to go deeper into Lacan and then Levinas in August. So July is basically like this thing that I'm just like insanely stoked about. I'm just trying to play it cool, but I'm just like, it's going to be great. With that, I think we're ready.
Say more about Levinas. Jim asked a question about.
Oh, Bryan said that Jim asked a question about Levinas. Which of his books should you read? Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know if you should try too hard to read Totality and Infinity before the course begins. You can. Rereading difficult text is always great, but personally, I think usually you kind of want to just read it with the cohort, talk about it on a week-to-week basis, and then reread later. Like, you got to give it some time to like have the dust settle. So I would say as a preparation for Levinas, and I actually make this plug in my conversation with Sue that is going to go up on the channel here in a couple of days because we had office hours and he was asking me about Levinas and Heidegger and stuff. I recommended to him what I'll recommend to everybody, and that is this book. Let me grab it. Where is it? Well, I didn't want to say it wrong because I forget all the time. So it's this little book called Ethics in Infinity. Everybody who likes Levinas loves this book because it's very tiny and it's very straightforward because Philippe Nemo is the interviewer and he's asking questions and Levinas is giving it to you about as straight as you're ever going to get it from him. So definitely check out Ethics in Infinity. I would just study this book as preparation. There's a couple other things. There's like a 4-hour, 5-hour video on the YouTube channel at Theory Underground where you can check out the exegetical reading that I did with Nance of something Levinasian. It's basically Levinas on Husserl and his understanding of Husserl. So that's up there. But also Existence and Existenz is a very short essay that he wrote while in a German POW camp. And it's kind of like the birth of his philosophy. And that's a really great place to go. Also, if you like Martin Buber or have been influenced by Martin Buber, he does write about Martin Buber. There's an essay you can find. There's a collected works by Levinas kind of book that you can get your hands on. And it has Existence and Existenz. It also has his treatment of Martin Buber. And for anybody who kind of knows that Martin Buber is the I thou guy, the basic point is that humans aren't its. We're not tools. Humans are thous. Like it's like this sort of like the dignity of the other concept. Like he really starts to develop that. And he's doing that at kind of around the same time, contemporaneous to Heidegger. But Levinas is like deeply influenced by Being in Time and Husserl and Sartre. And, you know, and then he's like doing the I thou thing in that context. And so it's way more rigorous, way more fast. I mean, really, like I think of Martin Buber and Heidegger made a baby, and it's Levinas. So there you go. And with that, let's get Bryan up here and we'll get it going for Illich week 3. Put your hands together.
All right. Okay. Yes. Give me your claps and your cheers. To speak to Levinas a little, as I've been preparing for this week, I've been thinking a lot about Levinas. I'm not going to talk about totality and infinity today, but I think if after today and if after reading In the Vineyard of the Text, it strikes you to think about reading differently and our relationship to our interior differently, and to reading itself differently, which is where we're going. Reading totality and infinity alone is good, with others is better. And I think is a natural expansion, if not challenge in some certain ways, but like it's a natural next place to go, one of the many next places you could go. So that's why I'm so excited for it, as just my own little plug. Here, the beginning is always hard. So what you guys have basically been witnessing, like I mentioned earlier, I think you all heard that I'm been sick all week, and I'm at the end of a long 9 months of not only having just kind of like taught the whole year, but preparing for this was way more work than I ever anticipated, whether or not it shows. And you've been witnessing to a certain extent me actively thinking this through as we go, on top of all the kind of like the work I've put in over the last, it's really been 9 months since I pitched the course to Dave, and I began then. And so in whatever free time I had, that's kind of when I started really getting after it. What's interesting and why I bring this up is not a poo-poo me, because I chose it and here we are. But In the Vineyard of the Text, which is the next book on the syllabus, it's the first Illich book I read. I think it's the most personal to me. And it's also the greatest challenge, in some sense, to the entire process I've gone through to get to this point. It's a book that's hard to pin down exactly, like many of Illich's later works especially. He wants to use history to resituate us and rethink about where we are, but without saying precisely what any one person should do in response to that history. There are some suggestions here, and those are what I'm going to work with. But really the bigger idea, and we'll get into this here in a little bit, is that by knowing history, I think, is the bigger point. It's only through understanding where we are, and what is unique about our particular place in time, can we really start making decisions about our life and what matters. Which is an essential thing to keep in mind with a book like In the Vineyard of the Text, because it, from one chapter to the next, it can seem like he's celebrating a type of reading and then totally assuming that it's impossible. Or for bookish reading, which is the sort of reading that I think we all do, as readers, as for bookish reading, it seems in some ways like he's rallying us against it, but also trying to save it at the same time. There are a lot of these, they're not inconsistencies, but uncertainties. And I want all of those things to be kept in mind before we begin. So I think what we're going to do some experimental Zoom stuff today. It's not that experimental. People have been doing it for the last few years since, the shutdowns and stuff, but we're going to do a breakout session or a breakout groups so that you guys have an opportunity without me like having to be like sort of big other you perform for, to just talk about the reading from last week or acknowledge that you didn't read it, and that's okay. I don't know. But before doing so, Dave messaged me 2 days ago and said, it didn't click for me what you meant by shadow work versus subsistence or vernacular until I read this, which was kind of like the point I wanted to like bring your attention to the distinction so that as you read through the essays in shadow work, you could hopefully see it on that first reading a little more clearly. I do want to draw before we kind of like set you off to just kind of chat about reading from last week. That way, I'm going to draw an example from my own life on the distinction between shadow work and vernacular or subsistence as I understand it. So that way, those who didn't read can maybe at least talk about that if you didn't. Okay. Hopefully some of you at least read some or parts or whatever. And I guess this room will be you two. Sorry, I'm going to listen to you guys. Okay. But this will be its own room, this room we're in. It occurred to me this week, I had never put the pieces together, that in a certain like very strange way, my parents, my dad and my mom represent both ends of the spectrum in very like straightforward ways. They divorced when I was 2, and I think like realizing this divergence between them, like I'm like, oh, of course they like couldn't stay married to one another. My dad would be on the shadow work side. Considering that shadow work is precisely that unpaid work that's done for the sake of the sort of the economy engine continuing to run. Maybe that's the way to think about it. It provides all the necessary things to happen for the accumulation to continue to happen. So my dad, but we're going to talk about our houses. Just like the way my dad and my mom treat houses and homes is completely different from one another. My dad likes brand new houses. He's always bought houses in the suburbs. And the humorous story we always tell, especially from my childhood, but it's still true today, is he had in his house like one of those like set aside dining rooms is like a suburban like house. It has like the kitchen area with like the kitchenette, and that's where all like the actual things happen. And then the dining room with like a formally set table. The rule in the dining room was that you never go in the dining room. He vacuumed, or he insisted that my mom, or then later my stepmom, vacuum the dining room so that the vacuum lines were very particular in the dining room. Okay. And so that also he could see that if someone had walked in there, because the footsteps show when you've done that. And my grandma, bless her heart, his mom would come to the house, and this pissed her off to like no degree. So she'd just like, she'd traipse through the dining room just to make him mad. I love my grandma. She's my favorite grandparent. Um, but this like is indicative of the way he treated the house as a whole. My dad, he loved the way baseball fields have the diamond pattern in their like in the way they cut the grass. And so he would sometimes imitate this, or at very least, if he didn't have the time to do that, he was very particular about the grass lines, the lawn being mowed one particular way, always being mowed on a certain day of the week, maintaining the image of the house as an asset. That's really what it came down to. All of this work was work that he did for free, or that often like his spouse, my mom or my stepmom, did for no pay and for no reason other than to maintain the integrity of the house as an asset. Keeping the dining room from ever being eaten in because it had carpet prevented the carpet from getting stained. and keeping it vacuumed maintained the image that the house is a commodity, not a place where he lives. He was simply, my dad, he treats houses as residencies, and he's constantly moving from one to another. Like he moves every few years, scaling up, using the house to, like builds equity, and then the house he sells, and then he buys a new house, that kind of thing. That is the mindset that Illich is pointing toward in caricature. And my dad kind of is a caricature at like this extreme level. My mom, on the other hand, she grew up on a ranch in rural Idaho. The town she grew up in is 200 some people. She used to say when I was a kid, um, it baffled me, and I think I understand now. But she used to say, like, I just wanted to be a housewife, and she was always really disappointed that she had to work. She's worked for my whole life and from before. She's always been upset that she wanted to work. And I think the distinction is that I didn't understand as a kid. What I thought she was saying was that she wanted to be a housewife, a la shadow work wife. But the house she grew up in was closer to a subsistence household than most modern people understand. Rural people, to a certain extent, still get this a little better than people in the city. It's not identical because they still bought prepackaged goods, and my grandmother still worked at the school kitchen to bring in extra income and stuff like this. So it's not exactly like full caricature subsistence, but they had a garden, they had rabbits, they had chickens, they raised cattle. They Any work that my grandmother did in the house to like feed the family was a gift to the family that she was giving. This was like the mentality they had. It was a very different mode of doing things compared to the mode of the house is something that can be bought and sold and made money with. And my mom still to this day loves to drive by the ranch that she grew up on because it's a special place. My dad, like, I understand why my dad is the way he did. He grew up in like trailer houses, same town as my mom, but like a totally different situation, right? The house that he graduated from high school in, he loved to say, like, I couldn't even open my door because the bed took up the whole room because it was just a single wide trailer. So for him, this image of like having the perfect thing is a rebellion against that upbringing. Whereas my mother had this upbringing that I don't want to idealize it. Um, because it is far from perfect. And even my own childhood, which is like the real example, the house I grew up in with my mom, who was the primary, I only got to see my dad every other weekend kind of thing. But I grew up with my mother, which you could say shaped me to a certain extent, or more so, like I got to see the distinction and make a real value judgment based on that distinction. But the house I grew up in is here in Boise, city house. Parents moved to the city for opportunity, that kind of normal thing. But our house, instead of having a dining room, which you weren't allowed to go into, it was like an old house from the 1950s with an unfinished basement that we moved into. And slowly but surely, my mom and my stepdad finished the basement. They put in a bathroom in the basement when we needed a new bathroom because I had two other siblings who were born and we only had the one bathroom. Instead of the dining room that was prefabricated from the architect's plan to be there and basically be purposeless, the kitchen was too small. So my stepdad and my mom tore off the back half of the house and rebuilt a new section of the house because we needed more space to get together to eat meals together. And this is what my mom really wanted, right? She wanted to be someone who provided a home for people, I think is what it really comes down to. And she always was that. And again, like I said, I don't want to like idealize this because my childhood was far from perfect. But when I think back to where like valuable memories were made and the quality of life, even in spite of the imperfectness, the quality came from a house that was always evolving with us. And the house went beyond the inside of the house. We started a garden. It failed because it was in the wrong place. The soil was bad, so they put a greenhouse there, moved the garden elsewhere, right? Always tinkering outside with whatever free time was available. And that house, unfortunately, my mom had to sell due to some things that you guys don't need to be privy to, but was always lived in with the intention of living there forever, rather than buying to sell and make money later. And she did have to move, and it was an ordeal, and it's a sort of painful event in the family's life. But the mode hasn't changed. The new house she has, she actually, I think she's getting more of what she desired anyway. She and my current stepdad live on a farm outside of Caldwell, which is about 40 minutes from where we are now. And it's the same. They just redid their kitchen. They planted an orchard. And they really want to be able to not only live off what they grow as much as possible in the world we live in today, not being purists about it, but they also want to be able to provide for other people. That sense of being able to do something that contributes in a meaningful way to the lives of others, I think is what Illich means by subsistence in vernacular. It is a very particular, situation-specific way of living that is responsive to our situation and builds on it. This is the tracing over of our lives, right? That we walk over the same place over and over. That is dwelling. And we're going to get to dwelling here in a little bit, but I can't pass my childhood home without sadness, right? Because the memories that were built there and the friend that lived on this corner, whose family still lives on that corner and their house has evolved over this time. But right, I pass a house that my dad lived in and I went to, I was like, cool, that was another one. Right. And so I think like the deep, regardless of like, it wasn't a perfect world, but it was a world which was imbued with meaning and value. And that's kind of the bigger point to this vernacular thing is how can we like reclaim some value? I think that's what Illich really wants us to think about. That's the personal story. But now I just want to give you guys a chance to talk about the reading. We'll set up breakout rooms. Hopefully between your group, it should, what do we have? 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Put them all in one or do two? Do two groups.
And one person can't participate.
Okay.
Because he's at work.
Okay. That's fine.
But he'll listen, I'm sure.
Yep. And if you could elect a representative from the group just to kind of like bring back what you guys are talking about, the main points you hit on. But other than that, you'll just kind of be on your own to talk about the reading or what in this course is either working for you or frustrating you. It's really up to you. And we'll do our own little breakout room and live here. Okay. Let's do. Okay. We'll bring you back when we're ready.
So if you haven't clicked it yet, there's probably a little button for you to join. Even if you're not able to participate, go ahead and click join, and then you'll be able to at least be a fly on the wall in there. Do you see? Yep, there you go. Lukas and Luke, do you guys see?
I think you can do a.
Can I just put them in there myself?
Force entry. Forced entry. Bring the battering ram.
All right. So, how do we want to do this?
YouTube.
Yeah. Should we pause this on this side, or should we just actually do this for the people who are listening?
Listening later.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys want to stand in front of the mic and just chat? I don't care.
Yeah.
So because there are going to be people potentially who sign up for this and
yeah,
just get the recording.
Hello, people in the future.
This is Deschooling Society work.
Oh, shadow work is over there.
You can talk about deschooling.
Oh, I like your copy of the Vineyard of Text. Oh, it's much better than my two copies that are both different.
Oh, man.
Those damn hippies with their different editions. Yeah. They were used, yeah. So, okay.
It's funny, like yesterday I was reading the introduction. I didn't have time to read the full book, so I said, I'll read the introduction and I'll read the actual, like, shadow work essay. Okay. And I was like, Dave, did you read the introduction? Dave,
no,
like,
I didn't.
I don't think so. And it was, the part about, like, self-help.
Yeah.
As this kind of new form of shadow work. That I just put a big exclamation point.
If you read that out loud, then I'll...
I can at least read this sentence. Or,
that red line, right?
Well, the lead-in, I consider the indiscriminate propagation of self-help to be morally unacceptable. What is here propagated as self-help is the opposite of autonomous or vernacular life. The self-help the new economists preach divides the subject of social policy, be it a person or entity, into two halves, one that stands in a professionally defined need and the other who is professionally licensed to provide it. Under the policies that are thus labeled as self-help, the apartheid of production and consumption, characteristic of industrial economics, is projected into the subject itself. Each one is turned into a production unit for internal consumption, and the utility derived from this masturbation is then added to a newfangled GNP. Unless we clarify the distinction between this self-help and what I shall call vernacular life, the shadow economy will become the main growth sector during the current stagflation. The informal sector will become the main colony which sustains a last flurry of growth. And, unless the apostles of new lifestyles, of decentralization and alternative technology and liberation make this distinction explicit and practical, they will only add some color, sweetener, and the taste of stagnant ideals to an irresistibly spreading shadow economy. I don't know. I really liked that paragraph.
It's different when you read it out loud.
Yeah.
I've read it probably 5 times in the last few months, just the introduction, you know.
Mm.
Paragraph makes more sense hearing it.
Yeah, interesting. Because I was like surprised that Dave didn't mark it up at all, and I was like, "Did you even read this?"
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And
that
it's
was what I was talking about with like the Huberman podcast. Like, I'm an expert, and let me tell you the protocols to make your life perfect. That's the implication. You would never say perfect, but like to make you like kick ass and all.
Yeah, which is like 7 Habits for Highly Effective People.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
Or 12 Rules for Life. Or David Goggins. And it's like, and I'm more sympathetic to it because I think just like sometimes things work and people need ideas about things to do. And the thing is like, I think there's this move of being anti self-help because you understand it's ideological, because you understand it's not like this panacea, because you understand the person who's making their career off of it is acting like everyone can do it when in fact they couldn't even do it if they weren't doing it full time. Right. And all these different things come into it. But also like someone like David Goggins probably, I have this hunch that it really is 300-pounder depressed or this Hulk guy. And he has 2 options. He doesn't have like this between that option. Like a guy with his kind of background of abuse has, I think this is probably just me projecting my own shit.
And I talked about that on a run once.
Yeah, I feel like it's either this or that. Like I kind of always have to go one way or the other with certain decisions. All that said, self-help, self-care, they are part of shadow work. And the part that was like really crucial, he's talking about stagflation, right? And this is a really big deal because Keynesian economics wasn't able to account for it. And so it was like kind of fucking everybody up and they were trying to figure out what was going on. And this last flurry of growth speaks to like a profitability crisis of capitalism. And the point is like, as profits get harder and harder to dependably bring in, this last flurry of growth is always going to be coming up in these various ways. But to have it come up inside of us and to be, and he talks about it in terms of self-discipline a lot in the actual shadow work essay. I think he's talking about self-discipline. It's all a part of control society. Like this is I wrote Deleuze in the side somewhere. Did you see that?
I don't think I saw it in this essay.
I think I wrote Deleuze in the margin, but maybe it was actually in deschooling. But the point is like, yeah, this need to have you self-discipline more and more is part of the control phase of capitalism. So I got excited about that. Yeah, I don't see it actually. So maybe it was in deschooling, but anyway, that kind of quilted it though for me. And it just made me realize like he really is a thinker of that and how that came about. So anyway, but I want to ask you like what you thought about like the section on women, the invention of modern woman.
Gosh, yeah, that was really interesting. I think Dave and I were both almost surprised by some of the things he was saying about kind of the history of women's role in society, in the household. Like he said some line that made it seem like women had more of a political, like
he said that they could vote
before.
Oh.
And we were like,
it's like, no, they couldn't.
Sources, like, what is he talking about?
At least not nationally. That's what I was thinking. The only thing that made sense, unless it's a typo, to me was like, well, then maybe he means women had local political power. which would make sense because when the men all go to Washington, D.C., and women are like caring for subsistence and managing the household affairs, not only do they have that local power, but they also had like the community center and like bigger decisions that got made there. And I think women did have more power in those spaces. I don't know. So, I mean, I've heard that. I've heard it. Where did I read it? I have no idea.
Yeah.
So I just had to assume that's what he's going on.
This is one of the ones I just can't comment on, and it's one of the reasons we're not reading gender, because it's like a bigger work I haven't read, and like, and that's like a whole, like you would need almost a whole course.
Okay.
Like treating like responses to like because it is. Where's he like? What are the historical sources he's drawing on and all that stuff? And so I'm like,
yeah, and I know he has all these notes that I kind of skimmed. But
most of those, none of those notes were for those interesting parts that we were like looking at from shadow work. I don't.
Yeah, I think like the bigger point I draw from it, at least from that essay.
You're too quiet, man. You're like, I don't know if I was working in Amazon, I wouldn't be able to hear you.
Yeah, albeit like, yeah, the facts, whatever the facts are that he's citing, we'd have to find it. Is that, yeah, the way that James Scott talks about like pre-high modernist world is that on their like property's not even owned yet in the modern sense, like the way we think about property rights is just incomprehensible. And so the way a whole village brings itself together in figuring out how it's going to distribute resources, who has access to what, when they have access to what. It's still on a hierarchy, like there's still more important members of the village than other members of the village, but everyone is a part of this larger conversation that's always going on. Yeah. And I think that might be what Illich is pointing to, that in subsistence, like nobody's fully silenced in the same way. And then if you go back far enough, like if you're thinking of Graeber's debt, or even just like biblical law, like the way that there's just the whole like leaving fields fallow, but also just like canceling of debts and restarting, you know, like because like the goal of the society is not growth, but it's like a whole different metric than we currently have, whereas shadow work is built to support the growth, which is the goal. And so whether or not we can find historical records that show like, yeah, women were still like sucked, but in a different way. Yeah. I think that's valuable. And he is adamant at various points in different writings. I'm never advocating we go back to the past.
For sure, yeah.
But it is hard to see that sometimes. It feels like he's like, this would just be better.
Yeah, but
for me, the big moment that clicked, and this will be worth restating when people get back, is just that shadow work is not chores, errands, and modernity. Well, I'm sorry, modern chores and errands is the way to say that. But like, it's just not. And I think the reason that's so non-intuitive is because like, we already know that housework is like unpaid. This is a common feminist sort of refrain. And so it's like, we instantly think of shadow work in that register, not as like a sympathetic, like imminent critique of that position, which is to say, no, but if you get paid for it, it covers over the fact that it's still like this unnatural and unfair thing that is actually killing you. And it is not just undignified labor because you're not paid for it. It's also undignified labor because it's made up bullshit. Like maintaining the dining room and the lawn in this sort of like insane way just to care about resale value instead of modifying things to make it good use values for your family.
Yeah, and it's like I think about my own mom too, probably similar to your dad, and just like she's just always, the house needed to be pristine all the time. It couldn't even look lived in. It's like my dad would leave a stack of papers that he was gonna get to tomorrow, and she's like, no, this has to be put away somewhere.
You know, it's frustrating. Like me and her dad are both like, we'd be working on things, we walk away, and then we come back and our shit's all gone. And it's just like, what? And then we were looking for our stuff because she
put away.
Yeah, but of course it didn't have a place because it was like we were working on it. So it's like.
So yeah,
that's one thing my mom didn't do, which like more and more I'm like, because she would say like my aunt was that way and she'd always clean up before people come over, make sure it's perfect. And she's like, yeah, but I live in my house.
Yeah,
like, if you're gonna come to it, you're coming to a house people live in, man.
Yeah,
I was like, it is refreshing.
Yeah. So even that has like this ideology of like everything has to be look clean for that hypothetical person that's gonna come over and like judge the house, and I don't know.
Are there any
Yeah.
final things we should touch on before we go peek in on people? I've never peeked in on people in
Let's try it.
any of these ever. I'll just say I'm glad we're being forced to read Illich. It's kind of like the course I always like wanted, like the courses that I have other people teach are where it's like I know I really have been wanting to read that for a long time, but I'll never prioritize it unless I'm forced through it by organizing a course with a friend. And if I don't do that, I won't actually do it. And so it's like it's kind of like when you pay for a course and you take it. It's like a lot of times it's like, well, I could read it on my own, but if I do this, I'll actually do it. And it's like, yeah, I didn't get to half the essays in that in shadow work, but I got through enough of it that I'm like, oh, not only do I have to come back to it, but now when I think of this critique of wages for housework that Gores develops, I know I have to bring in Illich. Well, also Illich on subsistence goes hand in hand, and also the vernacular, which kind of go hand in hand. Vernacular plus subsistence on the one side is exactly what Hannah Arendt is talking about as economics in the private sphere prior to modernity and in the human condition. And in the human condition, the whole book is about how that's gone now. And what we have instead is socialization. And socialization, or the whole thing is like, what does the human condition become under the regime of socialization? You could think of socialization as education. So like there's a really fruitful way to read Arendt side by side with
Educators
Illich.
literally pride themselves on being socializers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a secret anymore.
Interesting.
It's like, no, we're here for socialization purposes.
And I think she's also
particularly the people who educate for like civic goals, as opposed to like economic utilitarian goals.
Right.
Because that is a divided debate
within teaching.
Yeah. And within the academy.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Let's
go get in there.
I'll stop spilling.
Follow-up course on the human condition and Illich focused on.
Dude, I have a million follow-up courses. I would love to. I almost don't want to say it because I don't want to commit to any.
You don't want to jinx yourself?
I would love to do a course on subsistence, like on a topic rather than a thinker.
Okay, we're joining. Here we go.
Who are we joining?
We're joining the group.
Will you mute me?
Hold on. Why didn't it work? Are we in? Okay, well.
Of the difference between shadow work and vernacular, and we have the reflections there. So I think Cesar was saying that shadow work is all the work that is done in order for someone to go do a waged labor to like get the wage, and vernacular is not necessarily for that. Like it's not driven by being able to keep producing.
Okay, yeah, I think we're experimenting with new uses of technology. I hope you'll restate that for the whole group. I think in the future pop-ins are not. We're experimenting with just popping in to like listen like a fly on the wall. But
more like
we didn't tell you we were going to do that either. So
okay,
like,
then you're not here. Sorry. No, but I do struggle with this text because it does like, well, tell me if I'm ranting too much. But I'm again like I'm from Mexico, from a big city, and I am like pretty upper class. So, and I do see this, right? Like I never had to do shadow work in my life. Like I had always people doing the shadow work for me to go to school or for my parents to go to work. Like both my parents work wage, like they have salaries, right? But they never had to do any shadow work. Like the cooking is done, the housekeeping is done, and so on. So that's then moving to the US, that completely shifted for me, and now I have to do all the work. But yeah, I mean that also gives my parents time, energy, right? And even then, like they weren't like super present in my youth, which makes it's kind of silly, no? If you have it's like a weird loop because you are just going there to do the wage work and like outsourcing the shadow work, but that doesn't necessarily give you more time.
It's really good. Hey, we're actually closing out breakout rooms. We'll all reconvene here in just a second. And so we'll see you on the other side. We'll be right back all together. But that's a really interesting insight there. Ian and Spencer asked a really good question that we can probably touch on back in the room. All right, now we are back. Welcome back from the breakout rooms. While the recording was paused there for a minute, we were able to jump in and have a little bit of a back and forth in one of the rooms. The recording did pick up on part of that, but most of it not. And now everyone's back, and we're going to hear from Jim and then Cesar, in that order, Jim, then Cesar, and we're here for it. Let's go.
Well, we discussed about how certain jobs have become college graduatized. They started out as being requiring a high school degree, and then it just got escalated to now you've got to have a bachelor's degree. And I guess give it a few more years, you'll have to get a master's degree because we got to keep these colleges in business. I think the college universities are an industry. And they make money from selling degrees. And so a lot of degree requirements of a lot of jobs have been inflated unnecessarily. And, I talked about, when I went to college, it was the whole point of college was not to prepare you for a degree, but it was liberal arts education to teach you intrinsic learning. For intrinsic value rather than extrinsic value. And what I've learned from my experience is that you can't really go to college to learn a job because entire industries have disappeared since I went to college. I went to college about 50 years ago, 40 years ago, a lot of years ago. So that's basically what we talked about. Did I summarize it well, guys? Okay. Cool.
All right, should I go now?
Go ahead.
Cool. So in my group, I think initially at first we just wanted to figure out what might be this difference of vernacular work versus shadow work. So we started trying to brainstorm what that is, and Ian was using some of his examples from being in Mexico. I live in Arizona in like a large Mexican neighborhood, and so we were kind of using the examples that Illich uses, where he's comparing a lot of how Mexican post World War II is, I guess, changing. A lot of places are changing rapidly. And in comparison to, and so we were kind of seeing like, okay, maybe what are these examples of like vernacular work and maybe more Mexican communities versus shadow work. And we kind of thought of ideas like, I don't know, like babysitting, just like lots of like child rearing going on between lots of different families. And then Ian brought the point up of like a lot of these types of activities though are kind of rooted in poverty, and that we should be careful of overly idealizing if we start to notice we're idealizing these kinds of activities. And then Spencer couldn't really chat, but was writing out a bunch of I think like provocations of saying, okay, I think Illich would say that a lot of what shadow work is and what a lot of vernacular work is actually looks the same. But we should then be careful to see exactly what Illich is maybe trying to get at a little bit more with shadow work, how it's different, how it's like slightly different, because even some activities can be wrapped into what we see as like maybe a vernacular work could be wrapped into production or productivity that's still in service um, of basically having a wage labor job in a wage labor society. So just it's really hard to like find what this distinction is.
Cool.
Shadow work.
Thank
At
you.
least maybe we just want to.
No, finish.
Oh, that was it. I'm all wrapped up. Unless Ian or Spencer want to throw in anything. Lukash was also
No,
in our group, but hasn't listened.
That's okay. I'll go really quick here for myself and Anne, and then we'll bring it back to Bryan. But Ian had brought up being higher class and not having to do shadow work, and Spencer had asked in the chat about might the higher classes have their own kinds of shadow work that's harder to recognize. And I think the answer is probably a big yes, but we'd have to think it out. Let's maybe, if anyone has ideas, share that in the group forum, the Illich forum on the Discord. For now, I just want to say for our conversation, Anne highlighted this amazing quote. Can you pass me the book? From the introduction. If you don't have it marked up, and if you do have a copy of this, definitely check it out. It's in this edition, this newer edition, with the stick man who's like shoveling in the front. Page 2 basically goes in on self-help and talks about self-help basically being this sort of last hold of human life, right? Like it's where capital like moves to it says during the last flurry of growth, like it moves inside of us, and like everything becomes about self-discipline, self-motivation. And so like the difference in intensity between washing dishes prior to modernity versus washing dishes now. Just as an example of what Cesar was saying, where you've got vernacular versus shadow work. It's like might be the same seeming function, but things are different now. And we were talking about our own ways that it's different. And it's like, because we're so exhausted from the gigafied economy where we're working multiple jobs, balancing so many different things, and ultimately underpaid for all of it, the quality of our life in this house that we cannot modify to suit our needs is so different, right? It's so different. Not just because the lawn in the backyard would be a mini orchard, not just because we would have a couple of chest freezers in a workout area under like a shelter that I would build off the side of the house easily on a weekend. I would build that and I would use it every day. There's so many of these things, and we lack the imagination for it. I mean, we already, like, the fact that I said that I would do that if I own this place is because I've already wanted to do that. Think about all the other things that I would just do if I was used to living in places, right? And so my parents have a small farm. My dad's current house is one that he built to suit his needs after a life of living out there in the woods. But the previous house was a house that he built for market value. Very, very different vibes between those two houses, and I can kind of compare those. But the last thing is I just really want to highlight the differences. Shadow work is not equals to modern chores or errands, and the vernacular is not standardized education. And for me, like, that was a big breakthrough moment. And I think the most important place in shadow work, the book where he talks about vernacular, I think it's probably from The War Against Subsistence, that essay. The War Against Subsistence. He puts subsistence living and vernacular on the same sort of side, and what he calls the age of education goes on the other side. But I just call it, so I call it standardized education. He's not using that language, but that's language that became popular within our lifetimes. And so really we're talking about the difference between a universalized, standardized, leveling kind of education versus people to be able to have idiosyncratic, culturally rich, localized kinds of, not just language, but also just like practices, ways of going about and doing things. That's kind of what we talked about.
Sweet. Thank you. I guess during those, it occurred to me, so where we're going in the next, okay, we're already at 10 o'clock. Where we're going next week is, the final, grand finale. We're going to return to Tools for Conviviality, which is the book in which Illich clarified deschooling and took it beyond the institution of school itself to all institutions to think about society as a whole. And to clarify some problems he had, even like after writing Deschooling, Illich was like, things were muddy. There were a lot of points that I was trying to make that I'm not happy with. And ultimately that wasn't his favorite book. Like he really spent the rest of his life trying to clarify or even revise some of the thinking from Deschooling. Tools for Conviviality was like the first major attempt to do that. And I think it's a good one. And that's why we're closing here. In the Vineyard of the Text is the last book he ever wrote, and is going in a whole new direction. But I think I've taken my task here to be trying to find the common thread in works that seem sometimes obscure, or that the connection isn't perfectly obvious. And so if where we're going and what we've been thinking about, and like maybe the main term or concept for this whole course has been conviviality, I would suggest that there are kind of three terms that belong in the constellation that make up conviviality. They're somewhat interchangeable. Illich is never certain to use one over the others. Even conviviality itself, he's never perfectly certain that it's the best term. He's frustrated that English doesn't have a way of expressing the thing he wants to say, which is why it's hard to talk about subsistence, because it evokes a sort of life of destitution as much as it also evokes the other thing he's talking about. So it's frustrating. Vernacular is a little bit better. So we have subsistence. Vernacular is better because it talks about those localized priorities and ways of being that are non-standardized, right? As Dave was just sharing. So vernacular gets beyond just taking care of feeding ourselves, which is the connotation that subsistence has, even though that's not how he means it. Vernacular also has this sense of being really about those practices that bring meaning to life, that are not standardized, that are particular to each of our existence, our place in the world, our time in the world. But it still evokes language for us, even though in Latin that wasn't the case. For English speakers, it still evokes just this like vernacular language and can be limiting in that sense. So that's the other term in this constellation. And the last is dwelling, which he never says this is me making a connection. He never fully himself brings that in, like in shadow work. It's a dwelling is never brought into the equation with vernacular and subsistence.
He does say that the root is abode, though. He says
yeah. So there are all these little clues, and he wrote an essay called Dwelling. So maybe I want to use dwelling as our like starting point for today, because what we're actually talking about today is reading as a spiritual practice. If you get turned off by people talking about reading the Bible, this book is not for you. I'm just going to tell you that up front. Illich is not suggesting necessarily, he was a priest. Let's always keep that in mind. He was committed. Apparently his like daily prayer life was like a very significant part of his existence, even though it doesn't make its way into its writing. At the same time, I don't see his work necessarily as an explicit sort of evangelism. Okay. I do think that what's happening in the vineyard of the text is, if I had to summarize a way to conceptualize what he's thinking about, is that he's thinking about our interior dwelling space. Okay. I think he's thinking about our interior dwelling space and how even today the modern person is a resident in their interior, but doesn't have a real dwelling sense of dwelling, which is the spiritual aspect, the sense that I am building and like working towards something and becoming someone in some sense, to keep it simple at this stage. In the Vineyard of the Text is a commentary on Hugh of St. Victor's 12th century book, the Didascalicon. Hugh of St. Victor. Yeah, so I've got it right here. It's a fun read. It's a picture into an era of reading and of scholarship that is different from ours today. So the Didascalicon, written in the mid-12th century, he was the what's the term? The rector of St. Victor, the abbey at St. Victor outside of Paris. And this is his book of instructions for pupils on how to read. That's what the whole book is. Okay, so it's like one of the first major, if not the first major pedagogical text in existence in the West. And so in the Vineyard of the Text is, especially in the first chapter, the line-by-line commentary on the Didascalicon. Okay, I'm going to start, though, by pulling us to In the Mirror of the Past, which is actually a beefier text, which is why we're not touching it in this course. We would have had to do 2 weeks on it probably. I would highly recommend getting a copy if you really, after this, are like, I really like Illich. He clarifies a lot of things. Everything in here, these are the lectures and addresses he gave over the course of 12 years, from 78 to 90, at various different organizations would invite him to give a lecture. And these are the transcripts of those lectures, dealing with all the topics that he really focused on throughout his career. So you can get a little insight of where he's trying to be as clear as he can on the various topics. And it's very helpful. Dwelling is one of those. So I'm going to read 2 pages from Dwelling without comment, and then I'll kind of like bring it together. Okay. I promised I would do some reading and some commentary, and that's what I think this week is really going to be focused on. Last week was more context, but this week we're going to stick to the books themselves. This is an address to the Royal Institute of British Architects in York, UK in 1984. So 3 years after Shadow Work. To dwell is human. Wild beasts have nests, cattle have stables, carriages fit into sheds, and there are garages for automobiles. Only humans can dwell. To dwell is an art. Every spider is born with a compulsion to weave a web particular to its kind. Spiders, like animals, are programmed by their genes. The human is the only animal who is an artist, and the art of dwelling is part of the art of living. A house is neither nest nor garage. Most languages use living in the sense of dwelling. To put the question, where do you live, is to ask for the place where your daily existence gives shape to the world. Just tell me how you dwell, and I will tell you who you are. This equation of dwelling and living goes back to the times when the world was still habitable and humans were inhabitants. To dwell then meant to inhabit one's own traces, to let daily life write the webs and knots of one's biography into the landscape. This writing could be etched into stone by successive generations or sketched anew for each rainy season with a few reeds and leaves. Many habitable traces were as ephemeral as their inhabitants. Dwellings were never completed before occupancy, in contrast to the contemporary commodity which decays from the day it is ready to use. A tent had to be mended daily. It had to be put up, stretched, pulled down. A homestead waxes and wanes with the state of its members. You can often discern from a distant slope whether the children are married, whether the old ones have already died. Building goes on from lifetime to lifetime. Rituals mark its prominent stages. Generations might have passed since the laying of the cornerstone until the cutting of the rafters. Nor is the quarter of a town ever completed. right into the 18th century, the residents of popular quarters defended their own art of dwelling by rioting against the improvements that architects tried to foist on them. Dwelling is part of that moral economy which E.P. Thompson has so well described. It succumbed to the king's avenues, which in the name of order, cleanliness, security, and decorum tore up the neighborhoods. It succumbed to the police, which in the 19th century named streets and numbered houses. It succumbed to the professionals who introduced sewers and controls. It was almost extinguished by welfare, which exalted the right of each citizen to his own garage and TV. Dwelling is an activity that lies beyond the reach of the architect, not only because it is a popular art, not only because it goes on in waves that escape his control, not only because it is of a tender complexity outside the horizon of mere biologists and system analysts, but above all, because no two communities dwell alike. Habit and habitat say almost the same. Each vernacular architecture, to use the anthropologist's term, is as unique as vernacular speech. The art of living in its entirety, that is, the art of loving and dreaming, of suffering and dying, makes each lifestyle unique. I think this is where he's most clear on what he values. Like if we want to see Illich's values, these are them. Accept them or reject them. I think he's very clear here. And I want to take this value of dwelling, of community, of friendship, hospitality into in the vineyard of the text. I think without those, it's hard to see what he might be getting at a deeper level with his commentary on Hughes' work. In the vineyard of the text, again, I think is an urge to reclaim dwelling in the interior as a way of being, as part of the art of living. Okay. He says that the art of living, his simple definition here, is the art of loving, of dreaming, of suffering, and dying. All things which an overly standardized society deprioritizes or makes challenging, because the priorities have nothing to do with that art of living. The art of living in this sense becomes a habitus. Going back to Jacques Maritain, his teacher, he wrote a book called Art and Scholasticism. It was one of his earliest works, in which he argues that art, not simply the visual arts, but any art, any making, artifacts, any making of anything belongs to art, is not, he's arguing against this modern impulse we have to say that art is a matter of emotions and expression, but that art is a habitus. It's a habit of mind and of doing that's repeated over and over. So it's a physical thing that we do. And so I think, and Illich here is invoking that, whether or not he meant to. Habit and habitat are almost the same. And then he immediately transitions to talking about the art of living. The art of living is a habitus, but it's one that has to be chosen and practiced, I think is the bigger point here. And to the extent that we're, from the beginning, this is kind of the return to deschooling point. From the beginning, our interior architecture is determined by pedagogues. If we want to connect this piece, I, as a teacher, well, I'm not even going to say that. The teaching industry, particularly like the academy of like teaching researchers, are the architects who determine what is worth learning, what should be learned, and when it should be learned, and in what sequence. And they have a lot of ideas about how that should go about. And by the time, like in the perfect sense, like Illich is really quick to say, like, this never works perfectly. There are always traces of vernacular, like my mother exists today in the world we live in. And like, but there are traces of the vernacular in the way she approaches life. So this isn't one or the other, but in the way that is approached, by the time you get out of high school, you have an intellectual, moral, and spiritual architecture provided for you over 13 years of schooling that have shaped what your possibilities are and what you might think is worth pursuing in life. I think the bigger point is that, as should probably be clear, the interior life is, I think, I don't know you guys well. I know the two in the room. Interior life is like why we live. The reason this book is meaningful to me in the vineyard of the text is because it's a vindication of the interior life. It's a commemoration of the interior life, but it is also a confrontation against what we might think that means, right? There is at the same time, and he uses the words right in the beginning of the introduction, this book commemorates. I pushed a button. Yeah. Perfect timing. This book commemorates the dawn of scholastic reading. That's the opening sentence of the introduction of In the Vineyard to the text. This book commemorates the dawn of scholastic reading. Here's why this sentence frustrates the hell out of me. The dawn of scholastic reading, according to this analysis, is the dawn of clerical reading. It is the moment in which the idea of school is the mustard seed germ that eventually, now 1,000 years later, has shaped the way that we educate our youth. It is the dawn of collecting information as a cleric would do, who had a very limited role in the ancient world and even through the medieval world, a very limited role of record keeping and maintaining rites and rituals. That was the clerical role. It was never meant to be a universal imperative. The dawn of scholastic reading, according to Illich's analysis and all the historians that he brings into this picture, is the dawn when the clerical way of approaching things becomes the assumed need of everyone, in which we all need to read as a cleric. We all need to be collectors of information. And you can see that as school. It's like, this is like what Freire calls the banking model, right? The banking model comes out of this. Like, here's the information you need to know to operate in our society and go be a collector of information in whatever field it is you live in. Hugh is writing 100 years before the birth of the university. For those who either were or are going to go back to the idea of the university course, there's a certain challenge to everything Jaspers is saying, in that maybe the university could never have even approached its own ideal. And I would love to have that conversation with people in the future. Drop in a little idea, okay? And go back and read these closely. So the scholastic reading that happens just following Hugh's life, Illich identifies with other historians that Hugh of St. Victor exists at a watershed moment in the history of the technology of the alphabet. There are certain technological innovations happening on the page which change the reader's relationship to the page and change the values that they bring to the page because of what they can do with it now. So in a sense, the scholastic reader, to use simple terms, is an enemy of Illich, the clerical reader.
The clerical reader is the enemy?
Yeah, which is scholastic reading. It is the posture that scholastic reading took. Starting with like Aquinas, right? This like Aquinas is the way Aquinas writes, and the scholastic method of having, I was just in Aquinas last week. What are the exact terms? But basically you have a proposition. Here's the question I'm going to be arguing. Here are the objections to that question. Here's a common affirmation. And then here's my thought. This very systematic, rational approach to the text was impossible before Hugh and before this transition in this watershed happened. Aquinas can write something like 4,000 pages of the Summa Theologica precisely because this happened, and basically write a whole systematic theology with, to his mind, with zero gaps, as a collection of all our theological knowledge. This was impossible before these technological shifts happened, which leads in time to this approach to clerical reading, because the same technological shifts that allowed Aquinas to do what Aquinas did also allow for actual bureaucrats, the new clerics, right, to start keeping records of everything. And you'll read in here, I don't remember the exact numbers. My memory doesn't work in that way, and I am a failed memory person. The proliferation of written documents and the shift from making an oath. Illich loves to talk about an oath by either grabbing your beard or your balls, like in multiple writing. He's constantly talking about this. But the shift from doing the type of oath where it's by word, I'm going to do this, to the oath as a written legal charter or document is happening at this moment in time. Okay, because of technological innovations in the way writing is organized on the page. This is before the printing press, before Gutenberg, precedes it by a few hundred years. The point is that these innovations made it possible for this high moment in Gutenberg to happen in the first place, to even be conceivable. So we're before that. We're at the germ of the modern world. We're not in it yet. We're still very much in the medieval world. It's 1,000 years ago. So all of this is the stuff. This is what confuses me or causes me to struggle and wrestle so much within the vineyard of the text. The first sentence causes me frustration having been through it, because I know that he is a critic of the new clerical, bureaucratic mindset, standardize everything, right? That should be clear to everybody by now. But the first three words are, this book commemorates. And to commemorate is to recall and show respect for. To recall and show respect for the dawn of the Scholastic Age. Illich is no fool. He belongs to the age as much as anybody else. This is the birth of the age called bookishness. I'm going to read on, okay? It tells about the emergence and an approach to letters that George Steiner calls bookish, in which for 800 years legitimated the establishment of Western scholastic institutions. Universal bookishness became the core of Western secular religion and schooling its church. Western social reality has now put aside faith in bookishness as it has put aside Christianity. Since the book has ceased to be the ultimate reason for their existence, educational institutions have proliferated. The screen, the medium, and communication have surreptitiously replaced the page, letters, and reading. Illich is identifying that the watershed, and this will become important as you read, the watershed in which we currently live, we can see analogously to the watershed in which Hugh of St. Victor lived. A massive shift in the technology of the letter. Ours has shifted from the book to the screen. Okay. This is a huge conversation. Illich was writing in 1993. The computer, like what he's able to conceive of, like is pales in comparison to what we've got. And so we can't see him, I don't think, as a final authority on the cybernetic problem, so to say. But he does offer a really interesting contribution. So we live in a watershed, and I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind. We're living in a moment where those of us who are bookish probably feel left out. Okay? The world, and for Illich, this is true, and he's like, I am bookish. Like, I am someone who, like, reading is the way everything is done with this specific type of thing. Even at one point in one of his biographies, he had this insane reading list, and he was on like a retreat somewhere. And the plan was to read something like 10 books in one day or something. Like, I forget. I should have pulled it up, but again, I was sick. So the energies went to other things. I'll bring it for next week though. Okay, so he's a collector of information himself. And if you read the bibliography to this book, it's huge. So again, this is the complication. He reads this way. He knows that it's shaped him specifically, but also he sees something wrong with it. And that tension, I think, is a tension of never forgetting in the pages of In the Vineyard of the Text. What I think he's really trying to do, and let's get to that, is to recover different ways of reading, but also to understand what a bookish reader is and why it's worth preserving what we are, right? Or at least what I am. Some people have made a smoother transition to the technological world. If you're here, you probably are one of them. That's why I'm not around that much, because I honestly haven't made that smooth of a transition. It's still hard for me. I read hard copy books almost exclusively. I'm very much off screens a lot. But we live in a moment of that tension. We live in the moment of that
I
tension.
refer to you as I don't think they can really hear me, so you'll have to
Scream.
reiterate. But basically, I just say that like the core, like a lot of the core people at Theory Underground just aren't on ever. Like the Discord's dead. There's
Right.
It's because we have phone calls and shit. Yeah.
Did you guys get that? Basically, the core people at Theory Underground are not on that much. Yeah. I'm gonna leave that there. I'm gonna keep reading. There's a lot in the introduction that I think I'm gonna skip a few bits, but here we go. I here deal with the beginnings of an epoch of bookishness, which is now closing. I do so because this is the appropriate moment to cultivate a variety of approaches to the page that have not been able to flourish under the monopoly of scholastic reading. That maybe this is a moment we can reclaim a sort of vernacular approach to reading, considering last week's reading, in which the vernacular approach was all but closed by the elimination of grammar, official grammars, and this insistence that everyone learn this specific grammar, use the specific grammar, write the 5-paragraph essay, right? Focus more on the style than the content, right? And so maybe this is a moment in which new ways of reading can be explored and proliferate, okay? Not a universal, everyone should do this, but more so we can maybe use this moment to play around a little bit more, to see our moment as a kind of almost a time to play with what it might mean to either dwell in a text or use text to build our interior dwelling itself. Okay, so skipping, I'm on page 2 for if you guys do have the books or you've pulled it up. Skipping a bit to the middle of the 3rd paragraph. This book also does not in any way question the importance and beauty of bookish reading in its manifold ways. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. By going back to the origins of bookishness, I hope to increase the distance between my reader, whom I expect to be a bookish person, and the activity in which he engages while reading. There's a sense in which all of Illich's histories are meant to upset our assumptions of what is normal. For the bookish reader, the book just seems the normal way of organizing the alphabet. It seems like it's been that way since time immemorial. We're presented it from a young age. Here's a book. Here's where we get information from. This is changing again. We're in a moment that's changing. But now it will be the screen. That's going to be like, give it enough time. And even people are saying this about young people today. All they know is the screen as where information comes from. The screen, like be it smartphones or computers or whatever, is where information comes from. And it begins to feel normal. And you don't know how to access, and we begin to lose access to other ways of approaching language, right? One form becomes dominant. And so, if anything, this is Illich's way of just, even if you don't accept the reading model on which Hugh of St. Victor operates, recognizing it is a genuine, legitimate option amongst many options as a very minimal thing that he's trying to show. The other, I think, is trying to show the value of that model as something that maybe is not our exclusive way of reading, but is a valuable way of reading, which I'll get into that. Now, moving to page 3, second full paragraph. It's the long one toward the bottom. Bookish reading can now clearly be recognized as an epochal phenomenon and not as a logically necessary step in the progress toward the rational use of the alphabet, meaning that other approaches could have been done. So I'm going to do that all day. Illich always leaves the past open as the sense that options and choices were made and paths taken, but he doesn't see them as necessary and inevitable. Okay, so other options were presented, which is what Hugh was an alternate option that never got taken up as like the approach to reading. And we're in a moment too where new approaches are happening, but nothing has solidified itself as the way of going about informational usage or alphabetic usage in terms of the internet. Okay, so we're in a moment where what we choose to do maybe matters more than other moments of time in today, particularly with AI. As one mode of interaction with the written page among several, as a particular vocation among many, to be cultivated by some, leaving other modes to others. The coexistence of distinct styles of reading would be nothing new. To make this point, I want to tell the story of reading during a distant past century of transition. With George Steiner, I dream that outside the educational system, which has assumed entirely different functions, there might be something like houses of reading, not unlike the Jewish shul, the Islamic madrasa, or the monastery, where the few who discover their passion for a life centered on reading would find the necessary guidance, silence, and complicity of disciplined companionship needed for the long initiation into one or the other of several spiritualities, in quotes, or styles of celebrating the book. In order that a new asceticism of reading may come to flower, we must first recognize that the bookish classical reading of the last 450 years is only one among several ways of using alphabetical techniques. Again, I think we can hear echoes of Illich. This idea that before modernity, it's not that there was no technique or no technology. The alphabet has been around and used as a tool for writing for thousands of years. And that was another watershed moment in human history, from oral to written. Hugh stands as the second major watershed a few thousand years later. So it's not that technology didn't exist. The wheel exists, like all of these things we know of. Their relationship to everyday life was situated differently for Illich. It's that technology was one of many, or technique was one of many approaches to just everyday life. Everyday life also had abundant leisure, which had no technological function whatsoever. But technology was used in certain aspects for other ends than its own growth. And to me, I see Illich advocating a world in which different uses of letters are available, prized, and can then be pursued by different individuals based on their own needs, right? These are all echoes from deschooling, that based on what it is that you want to do, you can go find that particular place where here it is that the reading that you want to do can be pursued. Because he is saying it's an asceticism. The type of reading he's particularly highlighting here is a type of reading that really does take a lifetime, that takes up one's lifetime, that can't be accomplished in 13 years, even if you try, because it's a life's pursuit. Where did it go? I lost my thought. So
what is the
mode, though? That's the next bit. That's the next bit here. I'm setting up the introduction because this is like Illich's style. So Dave asked, so what's the mode? Illich's style is always to like kind of lead without getting there too quickly. The mode is ars legendi, which is the art of reading, or commonly known, and it is still used today, but in different ways, commonly known as Lectio Divina, which was the monastic reading of the medieval world. Okay, born in Benedictine monasteries, divine reading, Lectio meaning reading, Divina, divine. Okay, so it's a divine reading, and this is where, again, if you are like resistant to theological language, like he's reading a person who lived in a world, right? Like, I'm not going to apologize for Hugh of St. Victor, being of his time, and also being committed to something. before I get into what this method was and how I think even the non-religious can use it fruitfully who want to, I think it's worth a break. I have like the worst cotton mouth at the moment. I need a huge drink of water. Non-stoned cotton mouth.
I was gonna say it's all hot you smoke.
Coffee cotton mouth, that kind. Yeah, so let's take a break for a few minutes, 5 minutes, and then we'll be back. Because, dude, this one's going for forever. Well, I was going to talk about that, but now it's cool. Yeah, Dave was just talking about plagiarism in the underground, and you once thought you were accusing me of plagiarism in the underground, but you hadn't listened completely to what I was saying. But it is a real thing. When I was talking about Bierman's reading of Plato. Yeah. So I had said like, oh, this is for like, I heard it through Dave, who got it from his like teacher at North Idaho College, like about how to read Plato this way. It was for an Illich promo, so you might have heard it too. But that's it is a real thing.
But I only caught the end of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, by the way.
By the way,
I think you got that.
I got it from Bruce Bierman, who I've never met, but I know it's his, so he can have it. I know, dude.
Oh, they hit it off.
One of the things Dave was just talking about, which was all of these ways to experiment with, man, we should have been recording. It's okay. Was all of these ways to experiment with how to approach reading, considering now that many people read on either tablets or on computer screens or whatever, the control F function or the search function. When I do read, like I don't never read on, I have like probably 1,000 books on my iPad. Like I read them, but I'm selective about what I will read there. But the control F function, like this way of approaching how to find information within a text is the natural like consummation of or extension of the technological shifts that Illich is trying to highlight here that follow Hugh of St. Victor. Hugh of St. Victor, to keep in mind, was writing just before, like literally just decades before these major shifts happened. So he's the last in a line of readers before the shift, but he's already prefiguring the shift, and that's why he's so important to Illich. The shift looks like this. So initially, depending on what you know about language and the history of the alphabet, initially, everything was written as one script with no blocks between letters and words. Everything was a single script. So for example, if I am going to write like, my name is Bryan, it would be, there would have been no punctuation. The script just continues the way speech happens, and the letters are just representing sounds. No spaces. Up until the 8th century. So Augustine, that's what books look like to him. When Plato writes, that's what he's writing. When Aristotle writes, this is what they're writing. Okay. Can you imagine reading the Republic like this? The technology has shifted significantly. What this requires in order to read like this, and this is just like, go do it on your own time. I sometimes have students do it just to like make a point. Like I'll write a paragraph on the whiteboard. Like I'll just fill the whiteboard with this and I'll ask them to read it. They will read it out loud. Because you have to sound out everything, and you have to and they will read it slowly, and you have to discover as you read where the pauses are between words, because sometimes two words blended together look like a different word, right? If you've ever seen a word search, you just find words in there. Okay, so you have it requires a careful sort of reading. The first technological innovation was simply just giving some breathing room between words. This happens in the 8th century, so we're still a few hundreds years before Hugh of St. Victor. The manuscripts Hugh of St. Victor are reading have undergone this technological shift, but they're still reading out loud because we don't still have the punctuation. We still don't have quotation indications of a quotation, be it the first ones were underlines and later we got quotation marks. all things like that, capitalization. We're still very much in a world of just big blocks of text. There are no paragraph breaks, no titles, nothing. Okay. These are all really important textual features to be aware of that shift dramatically directly following Hugh's death, and that lead to the possibility of even conceiving of printing works as a meaningful endeavor to happen some 400 years later. Okay. What happens after Hugh's death, and Hugh's kind of writing at the end of this sense, where readers are considered mumblers. To read is a body experience where you're reading out loud because you have to. Because you have to. It was considered a novel thing to read in your head. Augustine taught himself to do this, and it was considered a marvel because his teacher Ambrose, he said he saw him in the middle of the night doing it because it's the only way not to interrupt people's sleep, was to learn to read in silence. But it was an anomaly, not the norm. It was not the common practice. Okay. After Hugh, we start getting titles and paragraph breaks and organization. And over the next few centuries, we're getting indexes. We're getting a new organization of what's on the page. When Hugh is reading, there's no framework for understanding how to search through a book. If I want to go into a book like in the Vineyard of the Text, one thing we always teach young students, go to the table of contents. Right? If you've ever had a reading teacher, you've been told that, like, where is this quote, Mr. Weeks? Go to the table of contents. Remind yourself what each chapter is titled. That will help you find it within the chapter. And then each chapter has subtitles or subsections. We start getting this really, really precise organization to the text, which makes it really easy to find information on a whim. So if in the Phaedrus, the critique of the birth of writing is not that it creates memory, but that it actually harms memory, because writing, now we can just store our ideas for later and come back to them when we need them. This new technique or technology for organizing a text, which includes titles and an even easier way to get into a long work, erodes memory even further, right? In general, generally speaking. And we can say even more so the internet, because all you have to do is go to Google. What, like a really like key like way, like nobody knows how to get round cities anymore because nobody needs to know how to anymore. The technology is, I'm being very much exaggerating. I love learning a city like in my mind and not using Google Maps. It's a fun practice for me. But it's completely different. And that's a really good way of thinking about the shift in memory. And memory is a huge component for Hugh of St. Victor. And I think it's a huge component for what Illich is saying that we could bring back, for the way we might approach reading as a practice, and as part of building like memory. If you think of what memory it is the contents of our interior. And to the extent that we explicitly draw memories, create memories, put them in places, we are building an interior space. And to the extent that they're just put there by experience or put there by being put through school, and we're not really sure what they are, we're just residents of our mind, of the interior space, to draw this analogy as far as I probably can take it. We just become residents rather than creators of an interior dwelling space. Okay. Hugh is, do you have any? Renters. Yeah, I use the word resident because that's the word that Illich uses in the dwelling. But yes, we become renters, residents, or people who are just using our minds for productivity's sake, and we don't need to know too much about what goes on in there. It just is. We've become, Illich's word, exiles. Okay. First, we were exiled physically. We feel isolated from everyone else, right? This is a modern sort of phenomenon in Illich's mind, this sort of exile, this very deep sense that my subjectivity, to go back to our first week, that my subjectivity is very much isolated and at odds with the rest of the world, and I feel alone. And now I think what he's getting at across his multiple writings is that in the computer age, we've also become exiles intellectually or spiritually. That screens somehow exile us even farther. That is a total point where I think a lot of conversation needs to happen, and he's very unclear on. That said, I do think that the interior space is worth being very deliberate about. Because if we are physically exiled from the world to a certain extent, if we can never get the convivial society we want, this is my argument, we can at least have this. We can feel totally alone in the world, but we can still feel some sense of having created a dwelling space inside that we can return to. And the book, again, for those who read Shadow Work, the essay that introduces you to Hugh of St. Victor the first time, Hugh thought of technology as a remedy for our incompleteness. Now, whether or not you live by the story of the fall in Genesis, what the story of the fall is simply, at the very least, if you only want to do it as like psychological explanation or like physical explanation for why things are the way they are, what happens at the fall is man has to work to feed himself and woman has to labor. Whether or not you're going to be on the side that God caused that I don't care. But the fact is, in order so we can see some common ground with Hugh, we all do have to do these things, right? We all are in this space where it feels like we're constantly having to overcome the world in some way, that the world and life itself includes struggle. And part of the art of living, according to Illich, is suffering and death, right? That is a part of the art of living. And if that is going to be a major part, we can use the technology of the alphabet or other technologies to help us live well or better. Okay? Because regardless of what we want the world to look like, it doesn't look like that today. So what can we do? I think that's sort of where Illich's hope is born, is that we can do something today. Hugh opens the Didascalicon not with the title, because titles don't exist, but with what was referred to as the incipit. It's just the first lines. If you read any classical text, that's really what we know about them, is the first lines, and that's how they recorded what they were talking about. This is the first line. The first line of the Didascalicon is, I thought I had it memorized. Memory is important. But of all things to be sought, the first is wisdom. Of all things to be sought, the first is wisdom. I really, 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 really wanted to be able to come here and say that we don't need to take that seriously, because wisdom is a nebulous term. I think there's a lot of, I saw this on Reels or whatever, like Žižek shitting on people who talk about wisdom, that kind of thing, because wisdom's so relative and you can say anything is a wise statement. And I was like, oh, cool. That's such a Žižekian thing to say. So I recognize the problem of invoking wisdom. Fortunately, I didn't invoke it. Hugh did. And then Illich repeated it. And here I am repeating it a third time. But I'm going to stand by it. I do think, because what we can be seeing is that reading doesn't have to be done for clerical purposes. If reading or learning in general isn't done simply for clerical purposes, for storing information, for maintaining laws, for maintaining customs, for maintaining the integrity of our knowledge in the sciences so that we can continue building new computers and new laboratories and all of the things that we tend to associate learning with now, if it's not going to be for that, for just constant reproduction of the same, what for? What for? And so wisdom for Hugh is wisdom of the greatest good, which is medieval talk for wisdom of God's wisdom, or wisdom of God's knowledge kind of thing. Okay. So I'm going to let us off the hook on that one. If you're religious, go with it. Go with it. I think that's a good one to go with. If you're not, let's return to, and this is why I started with the dwelling essay. Well, what is wisdom? I'm going to use what I think would be Illich's maybe temporary definition. It's the art of living well as habitus. Reading toward the art of living well. and making that our habitus. So it's not toward accumulating all the knowledge in the world, partially just because the like legitimate like impossibility of doing so. There are, I did the math. I always have to redo the math. If you read a book a day, which is possible if you have the time, for 30 years, you've read 10,000 books, almost 11,000 books. There are millions of books to be read, right? Okay, so there's just the literal impossibility in the span of a human lifetime, unless you have some other access to all the knowledge in the world. It also turns out that as we speak, computers are way better at reading quickly than we are anyway. So we've already lost. We've already lost the knowledge game. Like, it's official, I think, right? I think we can say we've lost the knowledge game. Knowledge game. That doesn't mean we've lost the wisdom game, because as humans, we still have to live well. And so it's not that we should stop reading and just let the computers do all the knowledge work for us. This is we really shouldn't. We really shouldn't. If we want to rethink education in the face of AI, we have to rethink what we're doing in the first place. It's not just because I want the world to be different so that as a reader, I can have more space to read. But it's that genuinely, like, everything we're doing in school, when I teach a student to read a 5-paragraph essay or write a 5-paragraph essay or analyze a poem in this one very specific way, AI can already do that. And they can already ask it to do that, and they're already asking it to do that. So it's already filling in that space that we've been filling and probably feeling exiled from the world as a result anyway. So in the face of this exile, what if we read for a different purpose? And what if we read instead more so for the art of living well? Does that mean that it's like totally this like selfish individualist, I'm only reading to like make my soul feel good or whatever? No, it's actually much broader than that. I think and this is why Hugh is so cool. Hugh has a hermeneutic. And so finally, Dave, to get to answering your question, what's the method or what's the approach? What could we be doing? Again, this is one of many. This is not the solution. This is not a thing everyone should be doing. But those who want to do it, let's think about it. Hugh has a hermeneutic for not only reading the Bible, which he thinks is the most important text, which you could probably imagine he does. But Hugh is also, in this moment, and a figure coming out of the monastic tradition who really celebrates the reading of philosophy and the sciences as they stood there, the natural sciences. The first half of the Didascalicon is like what you should read. And he has a broad survey of all the topics someone should know. It culminates in biblical exegesis for Hugh. But for Hugh, like biblical, like that is the most perfect book for him. Like it's for him, it's giving him everything he needs. The presumption is that any wisdom you could have starts there. But he's careful not to just reduce it like a sort of modern fundamentalist might, which is don't read anything else. It's dangerous. Okay. He has a specific hermeneutic for reading that helps him to think about everything we're reading and put it into what he thinks is the proper context. Is this hermeneutic perfect? No, but I think it's really cool. So the first is know history and know the facts. So as you're reading the Bible, before you can do any interpretive work, like saying what it means, you have to know it through and through. You have to understand. And for Hugh, again, if you read the essay from last week, Hugh has a very specific understanding of the history of the world that begins with the fall and consummated in Christ, and then ultimately will be redeemed fully at some later date. And you have to understand this history completely and fully and have integrated that knowledge into your being before you can start doing the next steps. And this is why memory is one of these important pieces. Again, technologically, we haven't had to use the kind of memory that's important to Hugh because we can just go search a text. We're like, oh, I remember it said that one thing. What was that? And we go do it. We're all so used to doing that. I've been doing it every week, right? Where was that? Hugh wants us, Hugh has a very specific program. There's a whole other book. I can't get my hands on it because I'm not even sure it's in English. I need to do some other reading. But instead of a memory palace, which maybe you've heard of, he has a memory arc for religious purposes. But I think it's cool. An ark is a sort of like dwelling on a sea, like as you're exiled on the sea. So I think it's a cool image nonetheless. But building the ark and having a very specific technique for holding information that you can call upon any time you need it. Illich contrasts this with the memory work that like a Roman senator would have done, which was memorizing a speech for rhetorical purpose and gaining power and prestige. Hugh is like turning that on its head using the same kinds of methods, but instead of doing it for the power, prestige, position, he's doing it for the purpose of some greater wisdom. Okay. Or for the art of life, if I want to do that, for helping us to live in the world we live in and know where we live. Because even if like you limit yourself to only reading the Bible, that's so much information to keep in your head. That's a lot, like truly, just like the history books from the Old Testament are bananas, like full of information and names and dates and pieces that you really would want to have fully incorporated. Again, textually, there's no titles in their Bibles. Well, they're not even one book yet. Each book is its own book still because they can't bound it. Well, it would be huge. They have no means for entering into a book randomly. Say, where was that thing in like the book of Genesis? You just have to know the book of Genesis. And if you want to get to that thing, you have to start at the beginning and read until you get there, because there are no paragraph breaks, there are no section titles, there are no verse numbers, all the stuff that if you've opened a Bible, all the stuff that we assume is normal, none of it's there. None of it's there. There's no chapter numbers. And so you would just have to read through it. So reading, you're training your memory. So as you're reading, you're moving things into the memory. And they have a really, really, really astounding level of recall. And they're building these palaces. That way, the next time that you start returning to a text, once you've really built this memory, and you're also doing this with non-biblical texts as well. So you're doing this with whatever the current science is, whatever the current, like if you're reading Plato or whatever was available. They didn't have Aristotle yet. That was like another 100 years, and then away we go with that. But even when you're reading those, the memory point is still really important. So then the next time you come to a book, this is my understanding of it, you can then start doing the important work, right? That part's the hard part because it just requires a lot of hard work to build that. And you spend your whole life kind of refining it and building it, which is why I'm thinking of it as a dwelling. As a dwelling, it's a thing you're retracing your own steps. You're leaving a thing here. You're moving it over there. You're recalling it at another time. You're going back to certain places more than others. And that expands and the connections grow in much the same way a sort of natural dwelling unit might, or even like a pre-modern city would naturally grow or develop just based on need, repeated use and things like that, rather than the official city plan, which is determined where you can go, when you can go there, and what use you can use it for. Then you can start thinking in terms of allegory and tropology. Allegory, I think, is a lot easier to comprehend. Terminologically, we use it pretty often now. Basically meaning like, what are like the areas throughout history, if we're thinking history or the world, what are the repeating themes? And what might one moment say about another? Whether or not this is necessarily appropriate today, or a biblical hermeneuticist would have trouble with seeing, Christ prefigured in the Old Testament. That's a large debate within theological communities. But for Hugh, that's like what you're doing. You're seeing certain things prefigured. You're seeing repetitions. You're seeing moments that allow us to then get a better grasp on some continuity across it all. Okay. And allegory is kind of the way you're going to do that. Tropology, or the tropological, as far as I understand it, is simply then turning that and saying, now that you understand the history, you understand the sort of the meanings or resonances through history, even if it doesn't fully mean anything, you can see some resonances. Where's my place in it and what do I do? That's the tropological move. What's my place in all of this? Where do I belong? And what should I do? I think that's what the historical essays that you guys read last week from Shadow Work are encouraging us towards. And that's what I think in the Vineyard of the I think that's what the latter part of Illich's work does, is not solve the historical questions for us, but raise them. Here's another piece of history maybe you didn't know about. Maybe you didn't know that Hugh of St. Victor existed. Maybe you didn't know there was another method to approach a text. Illich never says what we should do to it, other than he has a hope that maybe houses of reading, like the introduction says, might come to be. There's not a should or a must. That's kind of like what we only can wrestle with when we understand the whole. And that might be the sort of the bigger thing to think about as you're reading in the Vineyard of the text is I've made it abundantly clear I don't have that kind of trained memory. But what if that became something that was a priority to me? Like, these are the kinds of things I have to now think about as I'm challenged by Illich and by Hugh. What if I made that a priority? If reading toward the art of living is my priority or why I'm reading, what does that say about the choices I make in reading? Unanswered questions, and I refuse to answer them for you. But what does that say about the choices I make? What does that say about the fact that I had to go bananas in order to get here today? This is what I said kind of at the beginning, that there's an implicit challenge that maybe this bookish accumulation approach is constantly frustrating because it constantly needs more, because it's still built on the same model of accumulation. It's not goods, it's knowledge, but it's still a model of accumulation, which assumes that knowledge is scarce and I need more of it now. It assumes that we constantly need more and more and more. What would happen if those 5 books that we talked about the first week, what would happen if, not that I don't read anything else, but I make a point of reading those every year for the rest of my life?
Or even for a year.
Or even for the year, but like just the thought experiment, like what would be different? Like I would be forced by repetition to really put those to memory. What if I read Lord of the Rings every year until I die? On top of other stuff, but like it becomes the priority and everything else fits around that thing. So I can still go through the mountains of books. I don't think this is a either or. We are people of the bookish text, and now we are people of the computer. So we're going to find ways to use that technology too. We're going to do exegeticals online with other people. We're going to use Control F. We're going to do all the things we do. But what if, these are the what ifs that this book makes me think, what if we incorporated a slower approach? Because the ultimate for Hugh is not reading. The close of the book, Illich talks about the book is midwife. And I kind of like this image. The book brings something else into being. It's the midwife for meditation. For the vineyard of the text is the metaphor that Hugh uses as being able to read slowly through something, one, because he's forced to technologically. So there's no other choice. But because he has his memory so well developed that when he re-enters a book that he's already been to, he has his picture, his whole picture of the world, his whole interior becomes engaged, and he can start like enjoying and savoring the fruit, in the sense that you don't get the grapes at the end of the season, except for the work you do the years before preparing them, right? But then when you do get them, the savor is something special. It's something different, qualitatively different from buying grapes in the store. And so he wants us to read. This is how he trains his reader to read as a farmer walking through their vineyard enjoying and savoring the grapes off the vine as they go, with no rush. It's gratuitous. It's simply for the sake of enjoying. That's the ultimate thing that can be gotten through the reading. And so the meditation piece that's going to come up is really the savoring piece, if we're going to use more secular way of approaching it, but really savoring, right? Which you never get. And this is why I think, like, intuitively, Dave and I have been talking about, it's on recording multiple times. Like, you don't read a thing once. Bert talks about in that video, it's worth watching or maybe re-releasing. It takes multiple readings through something to really come to savor it. And, like, for those who don't know Bert, little plug, Bert savors books in a way I've never met anybody who does. When you get a text from Bert and you're reading a book together and he's talking about what he's been reading, he's getting things that I'm like, dude, maybe it's because he's been reading his whole life and he's going back through them and he's in a position where he doesn't have to rush. But I've learned a lot from that example, that if you take your time and stop blasting through a book as an object to be completed, but to be savored as you go, sometimes you do just have to get through them. But, like, that is the only way we're taught to read now. But taking the time to really savor and choose wisely what those books are. I have to wonder, as someone who is burnt out from basically just like, I need to read everything Illich wrote, or as much of it as I possibly can in the next 9 months. I need to read everything I can find and have time for that people have said about what he's wrote. I need to listen to all of the podcasts that have ever been done. But this has been my life at the expense. And I'm not saying, like, I'm not going to do that, but I am beginning to wonder. And I wonder every time I come back to this book, can I do this differently? Can I do this differently? Like, in spite of, like, the way the world is, could I do it differently? Right. And again, it's messy because we're all bookish readers. We're all used to having access to the book in a different way. And can we do that? Even Illich, I know he seems to second guess himself at the end, but it's like, can we do that in the face of the structure itself? Does the structure allow for it at a deep of level as Hugh was able to do it? I don't know. So I thought of today as an invitation to read In the Vineyard of the Text to all of you, so that you might consider, how else could we read? Because I do think that would be a convivial way to read. And I do think that it is the thing I'm going to be doing, as I fortunately am not in charge. I get to read Totality and Infinity with whoever decides to join us, just as a student in that class. I've read it before, so fortunately maybe I will get to savor some as we go. Second, anybody who wants to read Lord of the Rings, message me. Maybe not in the next couple months, but, like, I think that would be fun. Maybe one chapter at a time. I don't know. But I want to start with other people, exploring a slower approach to reading, because grad school fucked me. They say, like, I always got so frustrated by people in grad school. Like, I just skim everything. That's like the norm, is to skim readings and to, like, just go search for what you're looking for. And I was like, I'm going to read it all. And I did. And I'm kind of glad I did, but I'm rethinking everything a little bit. So next week, in the next week, please read In the Vineyard of the Text. There's a lot I didn't talk about. It is a challenging book to synthesize, but read In the Vineyard of the Text. And when we come back next week, it will be America Day. And we're going to talk about how to make America great for the first time. No. Yeah, we're going to read Tools for Conviviality, which really is a book for, like, not just our mental space, but our actual physical spaces and the tools we use together as people. So that's where we're at.
And ask the illustrated English is native language. You would have to repeat it.
So I guess the question is, did Illich write in English or his native language? All of the above. most of his major works, I'm pretty sure, were written originally in English. They were translated a lot, but he also wrote, depending on his audience, just in the language of the audience. He was a polyglot. He knew dozens of languages and was capable of speaking them at least conversationally. So he was able to just basically speak in whatever language it is he was working in. But I think his audience was Americans because he saw us as most demented, I think. Yeah, let's do it. Thank you, everybody. See you all next week.